Hi, everyone. This is Raquel.
Hi, and this is Jennifer.
Welcome to Madness Cafe.
This is a feminist podcast where we talk about women's issues, politics, and health and wellness.
And where those issues intersect. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Madness Cafe. Today, Jennifer and I are joined by a very special guest. Her name is Haley Shapley. And Haley is an award-winning journalist, a certified group fitness instructor, and the author of Strong Like Her, a celebration of rule breakers, history makers, and unstoppable athletes, which traces the previously untold history of women who defied convention in pursuit of physical strength. She's contributed to Teen Vogue, Shape, Self, Shondaland, Forbes Health, and hundreds of other publications. When she's not writing, she's usually working toward a fitness goal. Past pursuits have included running a marathon, riding her bike 200 miles, and competing in a bodybuilding show. Oh my God, that's so much. Haley, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome.
I loved the book, but before we jump into all things, could you just tell us a little bit about you and your history with athletics?
Sure. Well, as you heard in my intro, I sort of like to try a lot of different things. And I would say that started in childhood. I played a lot of different sports and did a lot of different fitness activities, including ballet and gymnastics, soccer. But I really settled in with basketball, tennis, and swimming as my main sports as I got older. So I was still, I was pretty active. I had sports practices year round. As I became an adult and I looked back on that time, I realized that I never really wanted to be stronger. I never wanted to get bigger. I wanted to be faster and more agile and some of these other athletic traits, but I wanted to be smaller, honestly. I kind of wondered where that had come from. And I think, growing up in the 80s and 90s, the role models were often very, very thin women. The sports that were popular when I was born for women were very much step aerobics and that Jane Fonda era. And so I think a lot of that shaped how I felt about sports growing up. I kind of started to strength train about 7 years ago. And that's what got me thinking about where these ideas about our bodies come from and what we're capable of and how that has changed since I was growing up.
When you were strength training, you said your focus shifted a little bit. What did people say to you about your body during that time period?
That's an interesting question. It's more common now for women to participate in activities like powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, CrossFit, obstacle course races where you're carrying really heavy objects. So all kinds of activities that require some degree of strength. And so I don't think it's as unusual to see it now, but I do still think that we have ideas about how far is too far for women to take these pursuits. And so particularly when I started to train for the bodybuilding show, people were like, don't lift too heavy because men don't like that, or don't hurt yourself by lifting too much weight, or don't change your body in a way that, might be unattractive. I should say, on the other hand, there were also people who said like, oh, men are really going to like you now. And so kind of whatever side they fell on, it still was really interesting to me that they were contextualizing this hobby that I had in relation to, how I would be perceived by men. I thought that was sort of unusual and probably not something that men get as often. Like, people were like, well, how will you date? How, and I'm like, when men are going to the gym, do people ask them how they're going to date? So it was interesting that we are more accepting of someone who chooses to maybe become bigger on purpose, but yet we still kind of have, there's like this very fine line where people think maybe you've gone too far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up because nobody's talking to men saying, or at least that we hear anyway in media of saying, well, hey, you don't want to bulk up too much. Women are going to like that. Or, you know what I mean? Like nobody puts men's fitness in the context of if you're going to be attractive to whoever, right?
Right.
So it's ridiculous that women have to be put in that context of, ooh, no man's going to want you. Who's going to want you if you're too big, that sort of thing. In fact, I'm sorry, that this brings up one of your quotes from the book that I really, really like that really encompasses this. You say, throughout history, women have largely been expected to fulfill two very important roles, wife and mother. From these two roles stemmed a cascade of other expectations. A woman should be pretty in order to attract a man and have children, straight in order to marry a man and have children, and docile in order to keep a man and have children.
Absolutely. And I think that sort of explains why we don't inquire about men who are lifting, like what their romantic prospects are now going to be, or how their attraction is going to be changed or perceived, and why we still think about it with women. Because even though we have moved beyond, I think, those gender roles in a lot of ways, those sort of cultural norms that have existed get passed down in ways that I think that we don't always realize. And I think it would be a mistake to not realize that just a couple of generations ago, women did not have a lot of options for what they could do with their lives. We've inherited some of that today as we move forward. It's still desirable to be someone who could be like a great mom and wife and all of that. And it still gets you farther if you're pretty and polite and all of those things, and ladylike, that women were supposed to be.
You're not seen as threatening.
Right.
Why did you eventually decide to write the book? And then I'm also curious, did you have fun with the research? Because the research seems really cool.
Yes, I had a blast. This was just I just geeked out on it for sure. I loved it. Prior to this, my career has mostly been writing short form articles, which I also enjoyed. But this was really my first opportunity to dig into a project for a long period of time and just get to chase all of those rabbit holes and go to research libraries and talk to people who are thinking about these issues. I interviewed more than 40 people for this book. So I absolutely had a great time working on it. And I still enjoy talking about the issues now as I'm, promoting the book or talking about it to people. So I think that's the mark of a good book topic, when you don't get tired of it. Because I have heard of authors who are like, oh, I'm done talking about whatever that was. And I'm like, I'm never done talking about this. So it's been great from that perspective. In terms of how I came to write it, I kind of, I mentioned I started to train, I started to get these comments. So I really wanted to know what the history of women in fitness had been, particularly women who were focused on more of these strength-oriented activities, but really fitness in general. And so I started to read a lot of books about the history of fitness, and I realized that there was very little content on women. Each chapter would have like a page about what was going on with women in a particular era or a particular sport. And otherwise, it was mostly about men. And so I knew that there had been women who had been chasing their athletic potential since the beginning of time. And I really wanted to trace that history and find out how it had evolved, and to see whether if we're at the apex of it right now, if we've been moving steadily in this direction, or if maybe there had been periods earlier in history where it had waxed and waned in terms of our acceptance of women and muscularity. So that's what set me on the path to write the book.
How do you feel going through the experience of writing the book and doing all the research? What sort of effect has that had on you as far as your feelings about fitness and the place that has in your own life?
I think it's made me more grateful than I previously was, just for, these trailblazers who I profile in the book. I start in ancient times and I go, all the way through today, looking at modern day issues. I had always been, even when I was a kid, super interested in Title IX, which was the legislation that happened in the 1970s that for equal access in educational institutions that receive federal funding for a lot of different things, but it primarily became known as, the piece of legislation that allowed for girls in junior high and high school to play sports, to have equal access to teams. And then as well as in colleges. I had always been interested in that. I'd always, been grateful that I had the opportunity to even play sports growing up. But I think that I developed like even more gratitude for my body by researching this and recognizing that even like no matter how I feel about it, it can do some amazing things and it gets me through life. And I am able to pursue the activities that I want to pursue. And it's kind of amazing how it all works, And so trying to, and realizing that these cultural norms that we do have about our bodies and our roles are really culturally constructed. And a lot of the things that we feel about our abilities are really just mental constructs, and they're not necessarily rooted in reality. Reading the research about that and just seeing how fast certain body types go in and out of fashion, which I think is absurd. Like body types shouldn't be a trend, right? They shouldn't, they're just a thing. They're not like fashion. They're not like clothes. They shouldn't be this thing that, it's cool to have a big butt today and it's cool to have broad shoulders tomorrow or whatever the different trends have been. But the body types really do change, like the way that we feel about them change very quickly. And just learning more about that has made me feel just thankful to those who came before and who are doing this research and who are out there on the front lines, just like educating people about all of these issues.
Well, you brought up fashion, and I thought that was one of the coolest and most interesting through lines of the book was how fashion in sports, but also fashion in women's lives, how they were sort of parallel, and also how fashion restricted women from doing the things that they wanted to do. What was your kind of favorite fashion story from the book?
Yeah, fashion really is a through line, and people think of fashion as frivolous, but it's not. It's actually really important. And that is one thing that I also learned while working on this. I think one of my favorite fashion stories, I have a few. One that I really like is surrounding bicyclists in the 1890s. Before that time, bicycles were really scary. People did not want to ride them. They had terrible names like the Bone Shaker. They had seats that were really high off the ground. Basically, you had to be like a young daredevil to get on a bike. In the 1890s, the safety bicycle came out, which was basically the version of the bike that we have today, where you've got steering, you've got tires, you've got pedals. Anyone within reason can get on a bike and give it a spin. You don't have to like do a tumble to dismount, which is how you had to get off one model of the bike, is you had to do a flip off the handlebars. So this became just a huge craze in the 1890s when this safety bicycle came out, and it was popular with both men and women. About 2 million women in the US started riding a bicycle. It changed everything. And one of the things that changed was the way that women dressed, because it's hard to pedal a bicycle when you're wearing a lot of petticoats, when your hemline is down to your ankles, when you're in a corset. Women started to kind of raise those hemlines a bit. They took off the corsets. And there's a lot of funny coverage in the newspapers around this time about, what the best boots to wear were and how you should not show too much leg, because that was just inviting male passersby to comment lasciviously and like all this, still putting the blame on women. Of course, they need to dress a certain way, but it's interesting. Like they had the pictures of women's ankles in different cities, and like, this is what Boston ankles look like, and here's what Miami ankles look like. And so that part was fascinating. So as women are starting to like unleash a little bit, they start to realize that they've been constricted in other ways that they maybe didn't realize. And this eventually ends up being a huge part in women's suffrage and getting the right to vote. one of the suffragists, and now her name has escaped me, but she called it the bicycle was the thing that did the most to emancipate women of everything. It was Susan B. Anthony, I believe, who said this. And I think that is sort of an overlooked part of history, is how getting that little taste of independence and getting that little taste of freedom and having a higher hemline allowed women to sort of interrogate other parts of their lives and see where they could maybe grab a little more freedom in other areas. So that's one of the fashion stories that I like, because it led to a change in clothes, which then led to a change in politics.
Freedom. One of the things that I've always said, driving is freedom. Driving is freedom. The bike must have been seen the same way.
Absolutely, because before this, when you went out, you had to go out with a chaperone. You were always had someone else around, and you were bound to when they were available to take you. And now women could meet up with their friends. Plus, they were getting a little exercise, which felt nice. At this time, there was a physical fitness that was in some schools for girls, but a lot of people still thought that just taking a walk was too strenuous for women. And so now they're starting to realize that, I am capable of pedaling a bicycle, and I'm getting benefits from it. And I do have a little bit more freedom now. So absolutely.
You mentioned women's suffrage with the bicycle, but then you also brought up in the book that there was a connection between suffrage and women circus performers, strong women.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that a little bit too?
Yes, absolutely. One of the sort of main characters in my book, if you will, is named Sandwina. And she was a circus star who really rose to prominence as a very strong woman. And this was not, common at the time. She was probably around 6 feet tall. We don't really know, because circus liked to make up stories at the time to promote their performers. And so there's a lot of myths that are mixed in there with the truth. She was born in a circus family. She was born in the back of a circus wagon. It was said that her mom had 14-inch biceps, and her dad had fingers that were so big that his wedding ring was the size of $50. And so she was born from a really hardy circus family. She kind of, at the time in the circus, a lot of the women were sideshow acts, but there were some very famous women who got to travel around in the circus and perform in the main ring. And these women had a lot of influence, because they were traveling at a time when that was difficult and seeing, meeting a lot of different people. It's hard to imagine, but back then, when the circus came to town, everything shut down because there weren't other forms of entertainment. There wasn't anything else going on. There wasn't radio or TV or, of course, the internet or any of these things that keep us occupied. So everyone would come out and watch the circus. And so a lot of the circuses had these suffrage groups that started within them. And the women in power within the circuses started to really advocate for a woman's right to vote. And people were listening to that because these were women that they looked up to. And so Sandwina was part of that movement. She was the vice president of her suffrage group within her circus. One of the main arguments at the time against women getting the right to vote was that they couldn't physically defend the country if needed. But with Sandwina, that was not the case. One reporter wrote, I would follow her into battle any day. She is absolutely somebody that you would want on the front lines with you. And so I think these women showed that women were capable of physically being strong, as well as having the savvy, understanding politics, understanding, having a say in what goes on in their regular lives. The bicycle, back to that really quickly, women started wanting to fix potholes in the streets, that they saw. And to do that, you needed to vote. You needed to have a say in with your local government. And so people started to realize women could fill these roles that we previously thought they couldn't. And so the circus performers did a lot, had a lot of like public events and did a lot to spread the message on that.
Sanduina had a platform to speak to people.
Exactly. Yes, that's a great way to put it, that these circus performers had a platform at a time when most women did not have a platform.
And what did women in general, if you know, what did they think of Sanduina? Did they like her display of strength? Was it something that they, like nowadays, thought she was too bulky or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So she was covered very glowingly in most of the newspaper coverage that I read. I think at the time there were several different definitions of what beautiful was for a woman. And one of them was a more sort of full-figured, strong, hearty, tall woman. In addition to, the really tiny waist from the corset, and that was another definition. Sure. But Sanduina fit into one of the popular definitions of attractive at the time. So that definitely helped her. We can't ignore that. She was also considered to have a very beautiful face, and that helped a lot. People just thought she was lovely. And one of the kind of publicity stunts they did at the circus was have a bunch of doctors come in and measure her. And they declared her the perfect specimen. Apparently her measurements were, exactly what they should be for an ideal woman. They compared her back to, those Greek goddesses and those statues back from ancient times. She was appreciated and admired. There's some really funny quotes about how her arms look in a ball gown, like supple. And a reporter describes her muscles as like mice playing in a mattress, just a little ripple. So one of the reasons why they liked Sanduina's muscularity was that it wasn't, it didn't have those hard lines that muscles can have. She had a softness to her. So that helped kind of make it more palatable as well. And it is interesting to note that her role as a wife and a mother was always emphasized in these articles. And that definitely gave her athleticism. It packaged it in a way that made it more palatable. We continue to see that happening for many decades after, where there's just always this emphasis on how women are fitting into their prescribed role. They just happen to also be great athletes too. And that was easier for the public to accept than, here's this woman who's a really great athlete, and that's all we're going to tell you about her. So Sanduina was asked a lot for her parenting advice, which was probably not completely relevant to a lot of people reading, because she had the list of like what she fed her son, who was 2 years old at the time and already 50 pounds. And he'd carry around like a 25-pound dumbbell as a toy, whereas most kids are playing with rattles or whatever. I guess not at 2, but they're not playing with 25-pound dumbbells. And so she was feeding him a lot, like more than I eat as an adult. So probably most parents didn't find that super relevant to what they were feeding their 2-year-olds. But anyway, it was contextualized that way. And so I think that Sanduina was admired, but I don't think that women at the time thought that's somebody I could be like, or even necessarily someone I want to be like, but they did think she can do some really cool stuff. And I think that that is valuable. Sanduina didn't really encourage, like her strength wasn't something that inspired others to do the same, but it was something that they thought was great to watch.
You brought up that most athletes of the time were acceptable because they were mothers and had children. If we flash all the way to modern day now, can a woman in modern day be an athlete without being those things?
Yes, I think so. I think that we've moved beyond that in a lot of ways, and we're getting to the point where we appreciate the talent just for what it is, as compared to, for men in general, a lot of athletes that we really look up to who are really talented don't have the best personal lives. They don't they're not the greatest off the court or off the field,
Yep.
but they're still respected because of how good they are in their sport of choice. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good thing, but I do think that we're getting closer to the point where we don't care as much about women's personal lives. Who are athletes, we are focused a little bit more on just what they do in their sport. So I think that there's a lot more room now for women from all walks of life to be athletes and to be respected. I think it's actually hard for some mothers, and I talk about this in the book. There were a couple of years ago, a lot of prominent track and field athletes came out and talked about the kind of unfair sponsorships that they had, that, these companies were marketing the fact that they were mothers, they were capitalizing on this, and then not paying them anything while they were pregnant or recovering from getting back into shape after having a baby. They were
penalized in a way.
They were. And, these contracts are all, of course, negotiated by men, and they're all also private. And so it took a few of these well-known athletes like Allison Felix to come forward and say, this is not fair. We deserve better. And now those sponsorships are changing. But it's interesting because it's still marketing a mother it makes a lot of sense, because there are a lot of moms out there who love to run, who want to buy those shoes, or gosh, we all are wearing yoga pants and athletic gear now all the time, right? And so it makes these women, very relatable. These companies are making a lot of money, and yet they're just not paying what they should. Of course, there are a lot of issues for athletes, again, from all walks of life. And so while being a mother is great in terms of your image on one hand, it can also be a detriment, of course, on another.
Right. Well, yeah. And there was coverage during the recent Olympics where I think her name was Allison Felix. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That she even encouraged some of the other athletes, some of the women who had children, to bring them with them to the Olympics. And she set up like daycare and things like that for some of those kids, where you would think that the Olympics would provide
anyway, that,
right? Because they're coming over with their families. Or like one woman who was saying that she was still breastfeeding, so she had to bring her kid with her. So you would think that more of this would be happening, but hopefully this is the start of something like that. So again, women athletes and women in fitness sort of bringing different issues to the forefront and being part of the change, like the strong women who are part of the suffrage movement, and women who were riding bicycles and realizing there's potholes that, guess what, if my bike goes in it, I'm going to flip over and there's going to be some serious damage there. Get everything fixed. Let us vote.
Right.
Well, there's a lot of controversy in the last couple of weeks, but in general, about trans athletes participating. What do you both think about that? I'm curious, and if you don't want to weigh in, that's cool, but if you have some thoughts, I sure would love to hear them.
Well, Haley, you're our guest, so I will defer to you and let you go first, but then, I definitely have opinions.
This is a tough issue for sure.
Really
I mean, I think there's so many perspectives here and so much to think about. I talk a little bit in the book about people like Caster Semenya, who is a runner from South Africa, who was born intersex, basically. So, was born as a woman, but has also characteristics of a biological male, and how that's sort of been treated throughout history. There was, back in the 1936 Olympics, there was kind of this fervor around a lot of the women competing at the time that they might have actually been men, and people were very concerned about that. And there was some really disturbing things that happened in terms of confirming your sex back in those days. That has evolved over the years. And now we're at this other sort of like inflection point in history, I think, for sure, with the swimmer, Leah, and I just forgot her last name, who's kind of been at the center of all of this. She actually swims for my alma mater, where I went to college as well. And so, I've been following this for a while, and I think that we still, in terms of science, like, we don't know exactly the role of testosterone. We don't know what advantages someone gets from going through puberty. We don't know if dropping your hormone levels to a certain point, exactly what that does. And we haven't had a lot of high level athletes in this position.
Right.
I think a lot of the legislation that's trying to be passed in states to stop trans girls from playing sports is mostly aimed at girls who just want to play recreationally. And, I think that there should always be a pathway for everyone to play sports, no matter what. I do think competitive sports are important, but I don't know what the answer is to.
I don't either.
I wish I did. I wish I had a great answer. I think that this is so complex. And I think the most important thing is that there has to be a way for anyone to get the benefits of physical activity. But in terms of competition, what is fair to everyone who's competing, I don't know exactly what that solution is. So I'd love to hear other thoughts.
Yeah, Raquel, what did you think on that question?
Okay. So
Put you on the spot.
yeah, put me on the spot. Sure. So my feeling around all of these laws and rulings and things that people are trying to put in place, preventing trans girls and trans women from participating on girls' teams and women's teams, I think it's ridiculous that they're trying to put these in place. And they're doing it under the guise of, we're trying to protect our girls, we're trying to protect our women. It just makes me it pisses me off, because there's this whole patronizing, protect the little woman thing that comes in with it that I think is ridiculous. And there's this weird policing of bodies that's tied with it, and othering of people that it just chaps my ass, and I don't like it. So I personally think these laws should just be struck down. If a kid is coming, or an adult is coming out as trans, they're already taking huge risk, and they're doing it because this is core to who they are. So nobody is going to do this as a ruse to be, the best person on whatever team and get accolades. That's not why anybody's doing this. As we all agree, all three of us are athletes. Haley, Jennifer and I are friends from high school, and we were on swimming and diving team together. So we're used to being on teams. We get the benefit of being competitive and being part of a team and being involved in a sport and fitness and movement and all of that. And so why should we take that away because someone is trans? Or why should we prevent them from having those opportunities?
Do you want me to be the devil's advocate here, or do you want me to let it drop?
I think you should just let it drop.
All right.
That's my opinion.
We should bring this back to Haley's book, but I just thought it was an interesting topic. I thought there was something cool in your book. You talked about if we choose not to view men and women in a binary way. Do you remember bringing that topic up, and what were your thoughts on that?
For a lot of history, we have viewed men and women in opposition to each other in a very binary way. So the more in vogue it was for men to be muscular, the more in vogue it was for women to be frail. And that is part of why we get this gender polarization, where if one sex is one thing, then the other sex is the other thing. And that's why women can't be muscular, because that's men's domain. And that really rose out of the Industrial Revolution, because before that, people tended to live on farms. They sewed their own clothes, they made their own food, everything they did was to subsist. And so men and women were all strong, because they're all doing these chores. And then as we had this, huge influx of technology that took these jobs that took all day long to do, just minutes to do. It allowed people to move to cities and live quite differently. And this is where we start to see the gap widen between, how people viewed men and how people viewed women. This polarization really hurts everyone because it makes activities gendered that aren't and shouldn't be. Of course, I talk in the book about how it's not good for girls, because if boys play sports, then girls can't. If boys are strong, then girls have to be weak, and that's not good. But it's also not good for boys because,
good point.
For one, like, they should be able to pursue whatever activities they want to do as well. And so many have this feeling that if a girl beats them at something, then that's really emasculating. That's not helpful, especially for young boys. And, before puberty, boys and girls have the same, they're basically the same, up till that point, in terms of physically. It's not uncommon for a 5th grade girl to beat a boy in wrestling or something along those lines. And so again, I think we're moving away from these binary definitions. Of course, we have a big conversation that's been happening for several years now about gender identification and all of that. So as we're moving away from that, it's still interesting because we've seen a real sharp rise in gender reveal parties. And I think that that's so fascinating because that was not really a thing until sometime in the 2000s, maybe even like 2010-ish. And now they're everywhere. And so at a time when we're less concerned about gender, and when we realize that the gender that you are, assigned at birth might not be the same one that you identify with later, as all of the awareness around that is going up, we're still like clinging really tightly to this idea of like, are you having a boy or a girl? That's sort of interesting to look at.
I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the ultra marathoner in the book, and sorry that I forget her name, but the men she was competing with said if she passed them, they would rather die than lose, and she beat them all, but none of them died.
None of them died. They all made it through.
Yeah. I read that one to my daughters, and we were laughing about it this afternoon, and they said, so did they die? And I was like, no, they didn't die.
Yeah, but it's that thing like that you would rather die than lose to a girl. And Teddy Roosevelt was a great example of this idea. He was like, I do not want my boys to grow up to be weak. Like, I would rather they die than be weak. And it's like, you would not rather your boys die than be weak. That very like masculine, manly presenting, I guess, attitude that really came out of the mid 1800s as well, with a whole movement that happened called muscular Christianity, where they started to associate virtue and being a good man with being physically strong and capable. And that wasn't really a popular, notion before that. But no men have ever, it's been reported, died from being beat at anything by a woman, as far as I know.
Unless it's a to the death.
I was gonna say, unless it's like a sword fight or something,
Right.
but probably. But in terms of just like running past you in a marathon or something, you're gonna make it. You're gonna be okay.
Well, when you yourself were competing, you said something about how you thought a lot about the male gaze during competition, and how, again, we'll go back to fashion a little bit and the wear and the things that you did in your competitions. Do you think the male gaze since then has changed, or do you think it's still super important when you're presenting as a female bodybuilder or weightlifter?
Yeah, well, I think it mostly applies to bodybuilding because that is a judged sport. So in powerlifting, it doesn't matter in terms of like how well you do in the competition, because it's just who lifts the most weight that day. And if it's you win. Doesn't matter what you look like. But in bodybuilding, you're competing in front of a panel of judges and you are trying to get their attention. You're trying to get them to look at you and to judge you favorably. The standards that were set for bodybuilding in the early days were definitely very much focused on that male gaze and what was considered attractive. And there were tons of controversy and questions at the beginning of bodybuilding about whether women should try to build as much muscle as possible or whether they needed to keep it within a certain limit. And we've seen that the amount of muscularity on women has really risen dramatically in the sport. I would say, like, there's a documentary I talk about in the book called Pumping Iron 2 that follows some women in the 1980s. And they are far less muscular than what you would see on a stage today. So it continues to increase, but I do still think that the male gaze matters probably in that sport, and in judging what's considered attractive on stage.
But you mentioned also that you had to like do your nails and wear makeup and your hair a certain way, or the bikini had to look a certain way. And I also read that to my kids and they were like, really? Her nails mattered?
Yes. And there's different categories within bodybuilding.
Mhm.
And the one I competed in is called Bikini, and it's sort of the least muscular division. But in that division and a couple of others, you have to have your nails done. You have to be wearing jewelry, but not a necklace, but you have to be wearing earrings and rings. And so, yeah, I had fake eyelashes on, and your makeup is sort of important, and you've got to be wearing high heels. So it was very kind of like traditionally feminine. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people who get attracted to competing consider themselves tomboys or women who otherwise don't wear a lot of crystals around. So you see a lot of women who are kind of like playing a role when they compete. And so it was kind of interesting for me in that way, because it did feel sort of like an anthropological study. And I was just like, I was playing this part that wasn't me in real life, because I do not wear a lot of 5-inch heels around, or tiny sparkly bikinis. And that's
Right.
part of why I chose it, because it was sort of really outside my norm and I thought it would be a challenge. But yeah, if you look at it as a sport, does that make sense? Probably not.
It really made me think about things like gymnastics and figure skating and how much there is even though they don't say they're being judged on that, there is some judgment on what they look like, what the costume is like, probably even their makeup, and truthfully, maybe their nails as well, because it is also, those are very visual sports as well. But I would guess that the male gymnast isn't judged on those things and the female gymnast is, although I don't know, this is just my opinion. I didn't do any research.
I thought about this a lot during the most recent Winter Olympics during figure skating, because it's only been a short time that women competing have been allowed to wear pants while competing, but most of them still choose not to, even though that's what 99% of them train in, because it's more comfortable and it's warmer on the ice. But they choose to compete in skirts still because of that judged aspect. There is this idea that it is more beautiful on the ice to see somebody skating around in a skirt. And there was one skater who wore pants out there, and I was cheering for her. And I think in ice dancing, it's a little more common to see the women in pants now for whatever reason. I think they've been able to wear pants for longer in that discipline. And maybe, the judging is a little bit different. I don't know all the intricacies of figure skating.
Again, it's that fashion through line, fashion and what you look like and what's socially acceptable in sports for women. It's really interesting. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating. It is. And like in the Summer Olympics, I know they put in some guidelines this past year in what was the 2020 Olympics that happened in 2021 to not have camera angles that objectified women while they were playing their sports, because in things like beach volleyball, when women are wearing bikinis, which is a good thing to wear when you're a beach volleyball player, but it's also just as good to wear pants if you want to. So now that's finally allowed to not have those objectifying angles, because that's not what they're there for. They're there to play volleyball, not to be ogled by the audience.
Because gross. It's gross. Yeah.
Well, and there was one team that was fined initially, the beach volleyball team, because they decided to wear like
Short.
shorts instead of bikini bottoms.
Mhm.
And they're like, this is ridiculous. We don't need to wear something that's basically going, halfway up our butt to play beach volleyball. We're gonna wear shorts. And then again, using fashion to control women's bodies and movement of women's bodies.
Absolutely. It was handball. I just want to say it was a beach handball team, which is
Okay.
not a very common sport. So easy to make that. Yeah, I know. And some women like to play in the bikini bottoms and women like to play in shorts, and either one should be fine. No matter, it doesn't affect them playing. And they of course tried to trot out these excuses at first that like, no, shorts don't work because the sand might get in them, whatever. It's like, you have no idea what you're talking about. The men are wearing shorts.
So we've talked a lot about like the differences between men and women and how women are oppressed and how, we're still looking visually at women. But another through line that I really liked about your book was the empowering aspect of women in sports, and how when a lot of your athletes that you profiled began doing sports or got further in their careers, they felt empowered in other areas of their life as well. And I think that's something we sometimes overlook. One of the things you said, and it sat with me, was like something like, you'll have to correct me if I have this wrong, but something like 97% of CEOs that are women played sports at some time, something like
I think it's 96%, but something right around there, that women at the C-suite level are overwhelmingly played sports at the high school or collegiate level. So you were talking about the benefits when you were swimming together, being on a team and competing and all of that. There are so many lessons that you can apply from that to other aspects of your life. And that's one thing I wanted to make very clear in the book, is that fitness it's a right. It's not this frivolous pursuit. It's something that really does affect all aspects of your well-being, including mental, emotional, social, all of that. And I think in finding out these stories about, like we talked about, suffrage and how circus stars and cyclists contributed to that, it really solidified for me how deep these connections are that I didn't even realize when I started working on this.
Yeah. In fact, one of my favorite quotes from your book is, when women shed the cultural norms surrounding their appearance and pursue physical goals, they develop an incredible toolkit that serves them in all arenas of their life, well beyond the field, court, or gym. And I mean, that really resonated with me, because I feel that completely. I mean, had I not been on a team, had I not competed in sports, I probably would have been a completely different person, and maybe not for the better. I mean, I think, the confidence that you get from being involved in a sport and the appreciation that you have for teamwork and what your body can do, those are things that are incredibly important things to learn, that carry forth in other parts of your life, like you say in your book.
Absolutely. And I think in addition to all of those things you just mentioned, one of the best things about sports or any physical fitness is that it gives you a chance to fail in a controlled environment. So many girls grow up and are afraid to fail. They're afraid to do something wrong, to get it wrong. And I don't know, I played on a lot of losing basketball teams, and at the time it was very annoying. But now it's great, because it's like, you know what, we lost, but we bounced back the next time. Like, you learn from it. You realize the world doesn't end if you continue to lose. And it gives you that confidence to take risks and to try things as you get older and in other areas of your life. And so that is something I think I took away from sports for sure.
Well, I thought your book was just excellent. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed sharing parts with my growing daughters. But I'm wondering, what else? What else are you doing, and what are you up to?
Yeah, great question. I'm still writing, and I'm still, talking about the book, and I'm really trying to figure out kind of what my next project will be. So I'm always open to suggestions from people. If if there's anything. I think I could continue. There's actually a lot that I didn't get to include in this book in terms of research. I had to cut 20,000 words from the initial draft. So
Wow.
there's kind of a little novella there. But I just continue to be interested in following my curiosity and just writing about women. The issues that surround all of that is what fascinates me the most.
I think it's interesting that you bring up that there was so much that you had to cut out of the book. And I really loved all of the athletes that you highlighted in the book, like the ones from history and from present day. Were there any that you either had to cut out or that you didn't get a chance to interview for the book, but you really, really wanted to interview?
Yes, there were, but on both counts, yes. In terms of historical athletes, there were some that I just couldn't include for space reasons. And, everyone kind of had to fit into a theme that I talk about. So for those who haven't read it, the chapters kind of each cover a time period or theme throughout history. And then I also profiled 23 modern day athletes in the book who come from a range of athletic disciplines and body types and backgrounds. And we did photo shoots with all of them, of course, because their portraits are in the book. There were so many who I wanted to photograph, but just scheduling didn't work out. Actually, Allison Felix, who we've talked about, was one of those, but she was kind enough to write a blurb for the book, which I really appreciated. Athletes are busy, of course. With the photographer Sophie Holland, who's amazing, we talked about how we could just do this project all over again with a whole nother set of 23 athletes very easily.
Yeah.
And we could just
Please.
keep going because we had so much fun on the sets when we were doing the photos that everyone was just really high energy. And I came away from each of those photo shoots super inspired just by everyone's stories. And I would get back to the gym and I would just go full force. And I pulled my glute the day after I got back from a photo shoot one time because I was so pumped, and I'm like, okay, you got to rein it in a little bit. But yes, there are so many amazing athletes out there who I would love to get a chance to talk to at some point.
Kudos to the photographer because those photos were amazing.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I know. I was super
Really
lucky
good.
to have the opportunity to work with Sophie, and a shout out to my editor, Karen Marcus at Gallery Books, who had the idea actually to have the photos throughout the book, which I think really enhanced it.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful book. It's beautiful.
It really is.
Yeah, it's really kind of almost a coffee table book, but also a fully researched, actual book with a narrative. And so I think it's a hybrid between those two, and sometimes people don't realize that. So I like to let them know.
Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't ask you about?
Oh, I've just been swept away in this conversation. So I guess one thing that we haven't really talked about is kind of the mindset that around limitations that a lot of people have. So I grew up being told that women in my family didn't have upper body strength. And so I really felt like I could never do a pull-up or I could never climb a rope. And what I've realized in adulthood is that those things are not necessarily true. There may be a nugget of truth there. We do carry more strength in our lower body in my family. That's probably true, but by not working on my upper body strength and by not believing that I could do it, I was really limiting myself. And so I cover a few studies in the book that talk about how when people are being given, some pill that they think is a performance enhancer, they're able to lift more weight. When they then are told, nope, sorry, it was just a sugar pill, they go back down to the previous amount of weight that they could lift before they thought they had this steroid. And so I think it just, really goes to show how much is mental. And I think that we get that and we know that, but we don't realize how that actually plays out. I would just encourage anyone who's feeling limited by something or thinks that some activity is not for them or some accomplishment is not for them to try to break down those mental barriers, because there is a real gap between what you can actually do and what you think you can do.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that goes
I'm
back
glad
to
you added
what you
that.
were saying about sports and competition being a safe space to fail.
Or to thrive, to do the thing you never thought you could do.
Absolutely.
I'm glad you added that point. I think that's super important. It shows how much our belief drives what we achieve.
Yeah. And I think by knowing about some of these trailblazers who've come before, once you see somebody do something, it totally opens up the door for you to be able to do that too. I see that. I've been going to a climbing gym recently and I'm just a beginner, but once I see somebody do a route, then I can suddenly do it. And on a bigger level, I think that happens with a lot of things. And so that's why I wanted to highlight these amazing women's stories, because they open the door for us to be able to pursue fitness.
Well, thank you so much for highlighting all of these women, Haley, because there were a lot of women that I hadn't heard of. They're so inspiring. Your book is great. I mean, it is so good. I think everybody needs to read it. Women, girls,
Boys too.
boys, men, like everybody needs to read this book. It's not only beautiful, like you said, it's not only, oh, this is a coffee table book, it's pretty, just let it sit there. But there's also this great story throughout it that you have written so well, and you highlight all of this great information in these amazing, amazing trailblazers. Thank you for putting all of this work out there.
Well, thank you so much for reading and highlighting it and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, that was so good.
Yeah, really good. I have two major takeaways.
Okay.
The first takeaway is thank you to all of those trailblazing women, because if they hadn't done what they had done, I wouldn't be running, I wouldn't have played soccer, I wouldn't have been on the diving team.
Mhm.
All of those things were possible because someone did them before us.
Absolutely.
And then my second one, Raquel, this is funny that she was talking about doing the photo shoots and feeling inspired. As I was reading her book, I was thinking, maybe I need to start lifting weights. That must be my next because, as we are in our early 50s, we all know that we start to lose some muscle mass. And I was thinking my running's been getting a little bit harder lately. And I was thinking, I need to lift some weights.
Yeah.
That's what's going on here.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because I was having the same or a similar thought of, I want to start lifting weights again. I had stopped partly because of the pain in my knees, which thankfully my knees are getting better, for people who've heard me talk about it. One takeaway for me from the book was all the talk about strength.
Yes.
And what the body can do. When I was going through physical therapy for my knees, one thing that my physical therapist said to me was, he talked about like building up the muscles and the strength so that the body can be better supported and all this. And I thought, if people talked about that part of fitness more, as opposed to fitness just to get skinny, then it would have such a huge effect on so many people. And the focus in the book about strength, courage, and fortitude, and just sticking to it, all of that was so key for me, that I'm like, yep, I need to get my mindset around what my body can do, as opposed to how small I can make my body.
Take up space.
Yes. Taking
Bye,
up space.
Bye, Raquel.
Bye, Jennifer. Thanks everyone for listening today. We will be back with more Madness Cafe next week. You can find us on Instagram at Madness Cafe Podcast, or email us at madnesscafepodcast@gmail.com. Bye.